Hi everyone, this lesson covers collective action for Introduction to Sociology. First off, let's start with the question, what is collective action? Can it be any action that is performed by a group? Well, it does involve groups and it does involve a coordinated effort or an action. However, it can't just be any action, and it has to be an action that goes against expected social norms of that particular situation. So, for example, a group of people walking out in protest on a speaker, that is a form of collective action. Groups marching down the street to protest a new law or to protest the government, that is collective action. It goes against what is expected of those social norms. If someone is speaking, you're supposed to pay respect and listen to them. The streets are for pedestrians, not for marching and protesting. So, collective action, as you can see, oftentimes takes a political aim at something, but it doesn't always have to necessarily be political. Some collective actions are for the purpose of having fun or just a hobby or interest. For example, there's this collective action known as flash mobs, where folks show up to malls and other public places and just begin to perform a choreographed dance. Once the dance is over, people just kind of go their own way. Flash mobs are coordinated beforehand, and an example of collective action that doesn't necessarily have a political aim. On top of that, collective actions can be split into two different categories. Crowd collective action is when people gather together face to face to perform an action. The flash mob is an example of this. Protesting on the streets is an example of this. On the other hand, you have mass collective action. So mass collective action is different in that people don't have to meet face to face. For example, if you've ever participated or heard of a boycott, for example, in recent years, Starbucks has been I guess you could say, victim of attempted boycott by groups. All sorts of companies have been boycotted. Another example of mass collective action includes mass emailing senators and Congress people. That's a fairly common mass collective action as well. There are several explanations out there to help figure out why collective action happens in the first place, the nature of collective action. One of them is called Contagion Theory, and a Contagion Theory argues that a crowd makes an individual act in a way that they would normally not be acting. So in other words, the crowd brings the animal out of the person or the more primal instincts out of the person. Someone who is normally responsible and acts rationally in a crowd can all of a sudden turn into a more wild side of that person. Contagion theory argues that this is because behavior is contagious, and in a crowd, you lose yourself. You lose your individual self, and you lose your identity. Your identity becomes the crowd's identity, and the crowd shapes who you are, and you begin shouting and behaving in the ways that the crowd wants you to behave. Contagion theory says that behavior is transmitted from one person to the next, kind of the same way that an illness is transmitted from one person to the next. On the other hand, you have convergence theory, which argues the opposite. Convergence theory argues that all you need for collective action to take place is for like-minded individuals to come to the same location. When like-minded individuals come together, they come with pre-existing values, beliefs, as well as intentions as to what they're going to do when they get into that crowd. So convergence theorists argue the opposite. They argue that the individuals and their intentions, their past backgrounds and beliefs shape the crowd. That the crowd doesn't have as much influence on people as we think. If someone was going to go to the protest and begin acting violently, that was their intentions from the beginning. Emergent norms theory kind of puts these two theories together. They argue that yes, people come to crowds with intentions and values of their own, but at the same time, when they get together with other like-minded people, at first, no one is sure how to act, how to behave necessarily. These norms emerge through social interaction, and eventually, through discussion, negotiation, and other social interactions, behaviors and norms start to take shape. Norms develop, and then shortly after, social order develops as well. And this new social order, sometimes there are hierarchies that are created, sometimes there are implicit and explicit rules that are created, and this new social order that has been negotiated guides behavior. So, emergent norms theory doesn't focus on the crowd or the individual, but what happens when people interact in crowds. And they argue that when people interact in crowds, they come up with a set of norms and a social order that people follow. Social movements are a result of collective action that all of a sudden takes on a more bureaucratic form when people become organized for the purpose of collective action with a political or social goal. Becomes a social movement. The other thing that happens in social movements is roles are institutionalized, meaning that people start to take on responsibilities, and this leads to expectations being set. This also leads to consistency, which allows people to kind of have some sort of structure within the social movement, and order and bureaucracy kind of starts to take hold in the group as well. There becomes a set of rules and procedures that are required for doing certain things. Members are connected in social movements through their shared collective identity. Usually, people that are involved in a social movement share an identity, whether it's based on race or gender or a combination of other things like nationality, interests, hobbies, those kinds of things. And normally there are subjective concerns that are felt throughout the group. Lastly, what bonds people in social movements is their collective commitment to creating some sort of social change or bringing about some sort of new reality into existence. Social movements do not exist in a vacuum. Social movements start out of perceived new threats or actual real threats, as well as opportunities that pop up in the environment. So these play a huge factor in social movements and how effective they are as well. Let's talk about a couple of different social movements. First, let's talk about alterative social movements. When you think of alterative social movements, think of a movement that wants to alter the behavior of a specific group. These social movements typically target a small group of people doing a particular behavior. These movements are very narrow and focused in scope, and the group efforts thus are more, focused in on a particular set of behaviors that they're concerned about. One of the most successful alterative social movements is Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Mothers Against Drunk Driving have accomplished quite a bit through their alterative social movements. Notice that they are after one small group, which is folks that get behind the wheel while intoxicated, and they have managed to create quite a change in society. It's no longer, seen as acceptable to drink and drive. It's very taboo to do so, especially if heavily intoxicated. On top of this, Mothers Against Drunk Driving are responsible for for the word designated driver. We all know this word; it's in our lexicon and naturally now. But before MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, designated driver really wasn't a concept that many people were familiar with. Next, we have reformative social movements, and it's going to sound a lot like alterative social movements. But while alterative social movements want to impact behavior, especially that of a small group, such as drunk drivers, reformative social movements want to make a small change, but across an entire society. right? So that's the key difference. And usually reformative social movements are going to focus on using the political process to change a policy, law, or way of doing things. Generally, reformative social movements believe that you can use the political process, you can elect the right people to do the right thing, you can pass a law through the courts. They work within the system to make their adjustment. So, for examples, the battle over same-sex marriage provided many examples of reformative social movements. There were many social movements out there that wanted to see same-sex marriage passed, and they did so typically through the political process, through the accepted means by which you reform society. And notice that they went after a very specific thing: same-sex marriage. They didn't go after a more broad action such as gender inequality or sexual inequalities. The organic food movement is another example of a reformative social movement trying to pass these laws geared towards changing this one specific thing about society. On the other hand, revolutionary social movements advocate that society itself needs reorganization. So it's not just one specific thing, it's broader things like gender inequality or inequality because of sexual orientation or racial inequality. Normally, revolutionary social movements don't really like to use the accepted political process to have their goals met. Typically, they go outside of this, and this can include violence. So, one example of a revolutionary attempt, social movement, was the Weather Underground. These folks were protesting the Vietnam War, and they went about it. They went about protesting and sending their message basically by any means possible. Their calling card was actually bombings, and they would bomb federal buildings in protest of the government. It was a collection of mainly students from the University of Michigan Arbor who took on this militant approach towards enacting a socialist democracy. And their goal was certainly to overthrow the government. And so they would definitely fit into this revolutionary social movement category. They wanted to radically reorganize society. So on top of bombings, they also performed a jailbreak of a person by the name of Dr. Timothy Leary. They went on to do several public demonstrations. At the end of the day, these movements oftentimes are not sustainable, largely due to the fact that they involve oftentimes illegal activities, and it gets them in trouble with law enforcement, obviously, especially if you're trying to overthrow the government. So eventually, everyone from the Weather Underground either was caught and arrested, or turned themselves in. So that is it for social movements or collective action. Until next time.